Human culture thrives when discussions about what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful is remembered as an ongoing, never-ending, never-complete conversation.
To quote Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty, welcome to Risky Conversations. I am your co-host, Ember Sadat. Join me and my co-host, Ace Deliri, as we engage in this ancient tradition of discussions around interesting topics with utterly fascinating people.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this one-off conversation that we're going to proceed with today. There's lots of stuff to talk about. What I wanted to do is just for a friendly reminder to our listeners. Why don't you guys give us a little introduction each? We'll start with Mike, and then we'll go with Paul.
Hi, Ace. It's good to be back. I think I expressed probably the surprise of the audience that you decided to have us back, especially Paul, to be honest. I mean, I can't believe that anyone's going to sit through the 2 hours. Is he on, by the way?
Yeah,
yes,
he's on.
No, I think everyone will be relieved to find that Paul's on here as well, so they don't have to sit through 2.5 hours of me. Hopefully it won't be 2.5 hours again for the audience. But so I'm Mike Driver. I really don't know what to define myself as. It's a very difficult thing to talk about yourself, isn't it? Mostly serial entrepreneur, sometime writer and podcaster of various things. That would be my introduction.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Our guests loved our episode with you, so don't worry. It can go for as long as you have the patience to go. And now on to Mr. Paul. Paul, please introduce yourself to our listeners who may not know who you are.
Yeah. So, well, first off, thanks, Ace and Amber, for putting this together, because I know this stuff is kind of tough to organize. So first off, and thanks for Mr. Driver for jumping on and kind of bouncing some ideas around. First and foremost, I was a trader for about 25 years. I've been unemployed for about the last 5 years, just watching the world go by. And that's pretty much a summary of kind of what I've done and where I've been. I mean, I don't have much to add other than that.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, gentlemen. So here's the first question. And the reason I brought you gentlemen on is because you guys actually have a very interesting way of looking at things. So there's sort of a theme of what I wanted to discuss about today. And what's cool about the theme is it's general and it applies in multiple fields. The theme is about understanding how to make choices. And there's 2 ways to generally make choices. And most people go one of 2 ways. Either they try to maximize the benefit of what they're aiming at, or they try to minimize the harm so that if they're wrong, they don't mess up. Now, as soon as you frame a point of view from that particular reference, what happens is you can start to look at how decisions are made, whether it's business, whether it's making a trade, whether it's locking down a country, whether it's injecting the entire population with something. It's all about the same particular process. So what I want to do is I just want to start with Mike, and then we'll jump over to Paul, is to see how he thinks about decision-making processes. Because essentially, people in your positions, when you're a serial entrepreneur, when you're a trader, when you're looking at businesses, when you're leading a family, the decision always comes back down to your hands, and you have to be held accountable for it. And the only way you can be held accountable for it is if you're given the authority over the people around you for whom you're going to make that decision. So if you're running a business and you do the democracy type situation, it doesn't work. You have to have a leader in charge. And that's why we have hierarchies in the military. That's why we have a CEO in a company. There's a person whose job it is to make the decision, especially the rough and ugly ones. And we want to start with Mike's point of view. Mike, how do you make decisions? And what's your way of evaluating the unknowns when you're facing something completely unusual?
Well, thanks for the easy question to start off with. I would say that I'm probably an intuitive rather than an analytic thinking style. So I think where would I take that? I'm very suspicious of facts. Facts, or I think facts have been turned into something else that's now called the science. And this is a fixed and rigid point, apparently. But facts tend towards, or the science tends towards completion. And I think there's a really big problem with that. And the problem is that things aren't discrete. Everything is continuous. So life is a continuous process. It isn't divided into bits. So by inevitability, analysis or the science or facts or factual analysis, however you want to look at it, is only going to get you so far, because it only tells you about what's happened in the past. It reduces your decision making to understanding what is known, and what is known is a very small, a small island in a sea of uncertainty. So I would say that my decision making is certainly intuitive. I try and function from Ian McGilchrist calls it intellectual sympathy, and I really quite like that. So where an analysis is just a tool, intuition is far from being a tool. It's rather than inspect the matter at hand, it places yourself, or you place yourself with intellectual sympathy within an object, or within a decision-making process, or within a situation, within another person's way of thinking, within a series of events, in order to coincide with what's unique in that situation, and that uniqueness, that can't be expressed as a function of other things, I don't think. So you have to be able to bring your intuition to bear. So I would say that the danger at the moment is we seem to it seems to be decline in intuitive thinking, with sort of the only way to think now is recognizably scientific or analytical thinking, and I think that creates many problems, because it assumes a universe that is closed, and obviously we live in a universe that is open. So I go back to my first point. Everything is continuous. It isn't discrete. And in order to understand a world where the future is uncertain, you need intuition. So that would be my first off the bat answer. And I'll just bat the ball over to Paul, who could probably put it much better than me.
So it's interesting that we both agree upon the same conclusion, which is basically be careful of what you know. The mathematics behind it, or the way I look at it, is it's similar to like compact space, right? Bounded, enclosed. And the problem that you run into with information is we optimize, especially in modernity, we optimize everything that we know, which ultimately fragilizes in some state space down the road. So we optimize some payoff space, like with businesses, they're always optimizing, maximizing the profit or the return. The problem that you run into is when you do that, you're fragilizing something else in the state spaces that are surrounded by them, and that could be a problem. I always use the analogy of the being a passenger on the Titanic. You can be in absolute excellent condition when you step on that boat, but you're ultimately exposed to the fragility of the boat itself, and that can and it dramatically affects all the passengers. So when people say, "Well, I manage my risk," I'm like, "Well, you do, but you have to. That's idiosyncratically. What you have to be careful of is the systemic risk that you're exposed to that you may not be aware of." And so one of the where you really saw this kind of come to fruition is in 2007, when all these companies that were expected to have managed their risk all of a sudden are exposed to the systemic nature, and it ultimately almost collapsed the system. Why is that? Because in a fat tail environment, you get this converging component that basically starts knocking down all the dominoes, and things where you thought, "Oh, I've managed this risk because I've subcontracted it out to somebody else." The problem with that is what if that somebody else goes bankrupt or fails? Now all of a sudden you don't have the protection that you once thought. So I think when we start making decisions, we're always used to making decisions in what I would call compact space, which is bounded and closed. So when we make these decisions, we always assume, "Oh, nothing can come and disrupt the game that we're playing." And I'm like, that's kind of the problem that we run into, is most of the decisions that we make are designed around a game, whether or not it be optimizing your grades or optimizing profits or something along those lines. And I think that's really what we're trying to kind of drill down on is, you can optimize the state space. The problem is you're exposing yourself to some type of fragility down the road that you may not be aware of. And I think that's kind of what we're all directly saying is be careful what you know, but more importantly, be careful of what you optimize in particular benefits, because you're fragilizing the system at some point down the road. Nature obviously doesn't do that. Nature forces all the interactions to occur. And I think that's what we start to realize is you want to be more nature-like than you do want to be more human-like, in the sense of humans want to optimize everything. And I think that's kind of been the problem that has been exacerbated by academia, sciences, things of that nature. So that's kind of my twist on this thing is that's how I think about decisions is be careful of only making a decision that you're in a compact space. Be aware that you have other exposures that you may not be aware of.
Don't you think it's interesting that most of the things that have real impact on your life are intractable? So I think that's kind of following on from what you're saying and sort of taking it, a stage beyond sort of investing and business and thinking about, thinking about the things that really affect people's lives, time and space and consciousness and relationships, their relationship, the sacred with God, with their friends and family. All of these things, the most problems of interest in the real world are intractable to computation. They're intractable because you can't predict which way they're going to go. I think it's quite interesting that almost everybody will utilize their intuitive self when dealing with those things, or try to, or probably not even realize that is what they are doing within their relationships, within time space, within their own consciousness. All of these things that can't be recreated by science or can't be modeled by science, to put it in that parlance. But people still use their intuition outside of those areas. They have to. I mean, we wouldn't have survived as a species otherwise. And yet people seem to want to put their intuitive natures to one side when it comes to making decisions that are heavily influenced by science or risk management. I think it's almost like people have allowed themselves to be overruled.
Yeah, I think that you and I see very similar as far as you use the word intuition. I might use the word emotional, but it's the same kind of thing, which is basically this idea that we really make we really make decisions with our emotions.
Absolutely. What was it? You call it the Cartesian fantasy, I guess, wouldn't you, of an isolated, decontextualized, rational mind that doesn't exist. Nobody behaves like that. Everybody lives their life in a reverberative and responsive world. It's not linear or fixed. Everything's always in flow. Nothing's ever static. So yeah, I think we're on exactly the same page. How are we doing, Ace?
No, that's excellent. What I'm gathering from you guys here is a concept of information loss, right? So when you take a set of decisions and you distill it to the quote unquote, let's take Paul's example of maximizing profit. So what you do there is you've lost information, right? And as soon as you lose information, initially you don't notice it because the abstraction layer might not be so far off the key. But that decision-making process of saying, okay, this has to maximize profit, for example, let's just say subprime mortgages and loans and whatnot. You took an entire banking infrastructure and you said to all of them that we're going to go for profit. Not such a bad idea. But what you did was you took that next evolutionary step, which was to take the abstraction where you lost information and take one more step with it, which was, hey, the only way we seem to be making profit is if we make these loans. Now you got a secondary order effect situation brewing. And as soon as you got a second firm doing it, that fragilization that Paul was talking about starts to manifest in a much bigger and much more faster clip. And as soon as everybody goes in that direction, all of a sudden you kind of forgot what you guys were originally supposed to do. Now this is what everybody's doing. And so that loss of information starts to compound And eventually you get to a dead end where what you thought was a profitable solution actually bankrupts you. So I noticed that same strategy is applied when you talk about follow the science. When you're talking about follow the science, the vast majority of people don't even know what the science is, let alone what following it would actually imply. What they did was they said, okay, we have a very complex system. Clearly, there's nothing more complex than the entire planet. Clearly, there's nothing more complex second to that, which is the human immune system. And then on top of that, you put the economy. So you have three massive complex systems all in conjunction, and you decide to make a couple of very reductionist-based decisions, which is to say, let's lock everything down. But the problem with locking everything down, as you guys remember, is that they didn't do the lockdown the way they were supposed to, because you physically can't do it. There's always going to be somebody somewhere who's going to be out and about. And the problem is you've reduced the metric of containment to lockdown, but you didn't take into consideration the information loss, which is, what if the guy you're locking down is completely healthy, but the guy who's a friend of yours who asks you for a favor to let you go do something, you let him out the door and you kind of, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, don't say anything. For example, that guy happens to be, I don't know, the CEO of Walmart or Costco, and he says, hey, you kind of have to let our store open, and it's okay if people are in there, and we don't really have that much requirement for spacing and social distancing. See, this is the information loss process once again showing up. You reduced it as a variable for small businesses, but you didn't allow for the interaction to take place where somebody much bigger was able to influence how that decision was going to be implemented. And so as a consequence, you got the worst of both worlds. You destroyed lives on the one hand, and you made a farce and a theatrical show of the entire operation because you let other places go. People where you're supposed to get healthy, get fit, go to the gym, you can't go there. Why? Lockdown. Why? We need to stop the spread. Why? We need to bend the curve. Okay, great. Oh, however, you can go to Costco and you could buy a shopping cart full of potato chips, and you can come home and eat that. And while you're there, you could interact with whoever happens to be at that store. So this again is about the abstraction layer missing the critical component of it. So as I would summarize it, it kind of works in the following way. You guys have heard the concept of the hot hand fallacy, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for the listeners who may not know, what happened was somebody was watching basketball and they said, hey, that guy's got a hot hand. Gamblers know this. People who play sports know this. People who lift weights know this. Sometimes you go in the gym and you just feel like you're on fire. You could just throw an extra 10 pounds and it wouldn't even matter. But other days, the weight that you would normally do 15, 12 reps with, you can't even get 8 out of it. So you know how your body feels. There's a flow state. You're in the zone. Everything is right. Everything is clicking. And a couple of quote unquote data scientists decided, you know what? I don't think this is true. So what did they do? Well, they looked at I think it was one season of the Boston Celtics, and they started to measure and say, okay, that guy looks like quote unquote he has a hot hand. Let's measure how it actually is. Let's see if it's random, if he's scoring, or if there's actually like pockets of like data sets where he's constantly scoring. And when they did that analysis, they came back and said, yeah, it doesn't work. Now, what did they do? All they did was they wanted to see how many times the person was scoring in a consecutive order. And they said that because they were watching that and there wasn't anything other than random, therefore the hot hand doesn't exist. Now, that's a extraction layer of data sets. And for scientists to be credible, you have to have data. But what's the problem with this situation? The problem with this situation is very, very simple. If I'm playing, let's just say the four of us are playing pool, and Mike has a hot hand. What we will try very hard to do is if I have a shot and after me I know it's going to be Mike, what I'm going to do is if I can't get the ball in, my strategy is going to shift. I'm going to say, you know what? I'm not having a good day sinking balls in, but what I can do is I can make it very difficult for Mike to make shots. So I'm going to try to nullify his hot hand advantage, so to speak, by positioning the cue ball in such a way where he can't get an easy, clean shot. And now I really want to test, quote unquote, how hot his hand is. So same thing happens in basketball, right? Oh, this guy's having a hot hand. Let's double him up. Or he was getting 3-pointers. Let's not let him in. Maybe he was getting layups. I don't know what it was. So the teams are going to adjust dynamically on the fly. But if you're standing back and doing a layer of abstraction by analyzing the data after the fact, you're not taking into account what was the defensive adjustment that was made against that guy. what were the shots he was initially taking? Sometimes you'll see it if you watch a game. A guy will score 3-pointers back to back. But now the defense adjusts to it, and all of a sudden he's not getting those same shots, and he flows out of the zone, and he's no longer making the shots. But from your analysis point of view, which is one layer of abstraction, you lost some information. The information you lost in this case is just what happened to the defense as they adjusted. So unfortunately, that same flawed idea that was initially considered good science because it had good data propagated. I think the whole original paper came out in 1986, and that idea was built upon for at least 20 years, where people are constantly pushing the same fallacious idea back and forth and then building other homes around that same idea. In fact, there's a paper, I'll send a link to you guys. It's not really even a paper. It's just this Albridge Capital company. They posted it. They said this is exactly how they got it wrong. So it ties back to Mike's point of view that these are not discrete states of point. This is continuous. The defense was not taken into consideration. The position when the guy was making shots was not taken into consideration. What if while the guy was having a hot hand, all of a sudden he, on his way back to the defensive position, he kind of pulled his hamstring a little bit. Now he's a little uncomfortable. All of those factors that nature, as Paul would say, that plays the final hand, wasn't taken into consideration.
Well, I think it's interesting, sort of, to summarize in a very few words. What we're talking about in a way is the difference between rules and principles, aren't we? So principles are ground up, and rules are top down. So anything that is imposed from the top down, an attempt to close the system, if you like, has the information loss that you're talking about. If you live your life, play your basketball game, make your medical choices, make your public health choices via rules, you will automatically lose the contextual information that actually delivers more of the truth. If you do all of those things via a set of flexible principles from the ground up, then you give yourself the opportunity to absorb new information as it comes along. And I think what we seem to have done in the last 2.5 years is tear up thousands of years of evolutionary principles in order to impose top-down rules. That would be my view. Principles are a set of thought patterns that enable you to deal with life as it unwinds in front of you. Rules are a set of criteria that are only reflecting what you've seen before. So I think you're always going to have that information loss, and I think that seems to be, it's all part of the same sort of the science, the lack of the total conformity. All of this really is a rules-based world that we've now very suddenly seem to be living in. We certainly haven't got here as human beings by progressing in a rules-based reaction to what happens to us. So I think that would be the distinction I would make based on what you're saying there.
Yeah, off of what Michael's saying, this is kind of, at least the way I view it, is this is where kind of probability runs into some trouble. And what I mean by that is, in science and in games and in corporations, things of that nature, you're dealing with a very structured environment, and almost game-like. People use the idea of game theory, and probability works well in those type of environments where the information is. I'm going to keep going back to this idea of compact space. It's bounded and closed, meaning like there's nothing that comes in that can possibly distort the game itself, because the game has a very structured, rule-based system, similar to what Michael's saying. And I think that's where the real problems begin. We take those ideas that probability should only be used in these very bounded, enclosed, structured, rule-based environments, and then we extrapolate them out into an unbounded, open environment that has multiplicative, multidimensional interactions. And that's when the real problems begin. So I think we have to be very, very, very careful about this idea of taking man-made tools or human-made tools or whatever they are, ideas like science and probability, and then applying them in all these different spaces. And for example, science to me is a subspace of a subspace of a subspace of a subspace, meaning like it starts out as it's evidence-based, it has to be measurable, it has to follow certain criteria to be analyzed. And so when you start looking at it like that, you realize you're dealing with a very infinitesimal amount of informational analysis that you can possibly evaluate. And so that's why I say you have to be careful when you use these tools, because we're applying them in very complex environments that have very high dimensional interactions, and that can create a lot of problem. It's fine when the game is closed and bounded and the rules are clearly defined. The problem we run into is we take that idea and then we extrapolate that into the real world, and we're like, wait a second, we didn't see this occurring. The answer is yeah, because people optimize state spaces, corporations optimize money, some people optimize status, or they optimize trying to get degrees, and in doing that, they don't realize that they're going to have to take those optimizations and apply them to the real world, and that's when the real harm starts to occur. Is this idea of extrapolation, rule-based systems that Michael was alluding to or pointing out, and trying to apply that to the real world. And that's where the harm is we take rule-based structured devices and we try to apply them to the real world. And the real world is so used to interaction, or is not used to, it's designed for multidimensional interactions. That's when the problems begin. So that's how I see all this, and that's why I am very similar with Michael. Is you just have to be very careful about the stuff that you're using and making absolute concrete decisions on them and going, well, that's my favorite words are, well, that's clearly a fact, or that's evidence, or where's your evidence, and all this other noise. And it's like, you guys don't understand that when you look at this stuff, it works in a very closed environment, but the moment you let it loose on the world, that's a totally different beast. And that's where I get kind of aggravated, is they're very casual about, oh, it's science, or I have the evidence. I'm like, yeah, well, guess what? Maybe in 10 years it might be a problem, or 5 years, or 20 years, or something like that. All I'm trying to say is it's not as clear and it's not as crystal clear as you want to lead it to believe, just because you're using a tool and you've weaponized it and said, well, it's clearly science, I can apply it to anything. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way, because it's evidence-based, and science is evidence-based. What about the things you don't know about? We haven't included those. And they're like, well, that's still, and that's my big grind with all this.
No, I totally agree with that. And one of the things that jumps out when you talk about the way things have been structured is, initially, if we go back and study how science was done, initially it was just basically gentlemen sitting around thinking about a particular process. And it goes back to Newton or Galileo if you want to go further back, and Tycho Brahe if you want to go even further back. Somewhere along the lines, a bunch of people start to notice that there's money to be made in this, there's prestige in this, there's world-class fame in this, there's immortality in this, and all of a sudden, like you said, the game starts to get played. Right? Initially, if you think about the first person who ever decided to sit down and think about nature, nobody else was pursuing it. So in a way, it was pure. And in another way, what it was is, initially it wasn't worthy of being corrupted. But now it's entirely corrupted. And the reason we know that it's entirely corrupted is we look at the language that they use when they talk about things. For up until 1960, the whole concept of peer review didn't really mean anything. Nowadays, people are conditioned to immediately say, well, I don't trust anything until it's peer reviewed. So I'm like, peer review doesn't mean it's reviewed by your peers. You get what I'm saying? So the person who's at your level, if you're a high quality scientist, you probably don't have that many peers to start with. If you're truly a breakthrough type of thinker, where you're looking at places where nobody else is seeing it, you don't have any peers. So who's going to really evaluate your work? Nature is. So what we have to do is take a look at your concept, allow us to formulate a test, so we can run your concept through that test and see what happens. That's not the same thing as, well, these are 50 guys who have excellent pedigrees and they're going to read your paper. And they're going to disagree with your paper. And we have to ask the question, what are they disagreeing based on? Is it just pedigree? Is it personal petty gripes? Is it a dislike for the person because maybe they're cantankerous in nature? We don't know that. But somehow it's all been distilled to science doesn't mean anything unless it's peer reviewed. But as we saw during COVID, even that peer review process itself can be captured. So you have layers that are built in, which is now you have gatekeepers. Prestigious journals have people who won't let just anybody, quote unquote, publish because they don't want to allow noise to get into the system. But sometimes those same people who are avoiding a specific type of noise from getting into the system are also suffocating potential new signals from a new harvest, from a whole new territory where you can say, okay, let's break into that area and see if we can harvest some fruits. So in essence, what's actually happened here is this capture that we're always talking about. The people who are meant to police everybody else are now policing themselves to not police certain voices. So it turns into this weird echo chamber where if you said anything, like Mike was one of the first people I recall saying that the lockdown costs are going to exceed the benefits of anything these people have imagined. And at the time he was saying it, I remembered it was still relatively early in 2020. And I think what happened was initially most of us were on board with this idea. And I'll be first to admit, I didn't know enough. So I said, okay, when things are bad, let's apply the precautionary principle. It later dawned on me that the precautionary principle has a fundamental flaw, which is that it takes human beings to apply that same solution to other human beings. And human beings have favorites. Oh, my favorite guy he owns Costco. My other favorite guy owns Walmart. We're going to let it slide. As soon as I saw that start to happen, I realized, I made a big mistake. I misunderstood the implications of such a blanket statement. And I learned my lesson very, very quickly from that. But it was interesting when Mike started to talk about it. Me and Mike were talking, and he specifically said to me that, hey, the cost of these lockdowns is going to be much worse than anything that this thing could have ever done. And so I want to bring it back to Mike and say, how did you see that so quickly in early 2020 when it took the rest of the world? And actually, some parts of the world still haven't seen that point of view.
I think experience of being exposed to risky situations a lot. So you when you've negotiated a lot of business deals, sold a lot of things, when you've been involved in business for 30 years or 28 years as it was then, your antennae is alert. You're aware. You're very alert to the things that I considered. Firstly, is you can't really trust politicians. You can't really trust corporate CEOs. You can't trust the billionaire class. So if you take that as a principle, so rather than thinking of a rule, say look that lockdown, don't go without further than 300 meters from your house or whatever some of the crazy rules were. But actually go back to thinking in terms of a principle. So my principle was deception is Darwinian. Always be very, very careful when dealing with human beings if some of the things they're advocating is going to make them very, very rich. So when you look at the sort of the series of events that evolved, I went back to the principle of being suspicious. So I did a few things. I read the Pfizer trial documentation. So that effectively I looked at it and said, what would I do if I wanted to hide this particular injection didn't work very well? So I worked with the principle of what would I do as a long-time entrepreneur. I think I've said before, you've got to be prepared to cut a few corners if you want to succeed as a business person. What would I do? So it's that sort of intellectual sympathy that sort of gives you the opportunity to use your intuition. What would I do if I was a work for Pfizer or Moderna? What would I do if I was a politician with an ulterior motive? And so you start looking at things through a different set of principles and through a different lens. And those are all the things that made me alert. And then really, when you think about what we surrendered, effectively people surrendered their freedom. And I believe that freedom is the basis, the foundation to everything. You can't love somebody unless you're free to love them. You can't enjoy anything that is forced upon you. I certainly can't. I guess some people enjoy the constructed fun of cruises and the like, but it doesn't work for me. But I think freedom to be the basis for everything else. Nothing. And I think I've said before, millions of people died to maintain these freedoms, and then we give them up as something that as far as I could see, it looked like infections were already declining on the first lockdown. It looked like they were going down even before we locked down. So there was holes. There was the cruise ship. I think there was sort of a petri dish of how infectious and how deadly this illness was. So I think when you're always on the lookout, for being deceived, it gives you the opportunity to observe the holes in the argument, and that the holes I thought you could have driven a truck through them. It was quite a surprise to find out I was almost on my own. I must give a shout out to George Cooper and say that George and I were on our own. I think around about March, April 20, it felt like we're the only two people in Britain that were against the lockdown. So, and I think that the opportunity that governments then had to remove freedom, I think that was the scariest thing of all for me, because that is as I say, I think that is the foundation to all human life. So that would be my summary of how I got to my position.
You know, what's kind of interesting is because we've never talked about this stuff in a format like this. And what I find very interesting is we all kind of come to the same conclusion. We just use a different path and the words that we use, but it's always a reoccurring theme that there's a skeptical nature about kind of how we look at the world. When I look at these things, in particular, man-made things like academia, religion, science, politics, or even the law, what you start to realize is these things can be weaponized, and they can be used against the exact thing that they're trying to either promote and or protect. And so rule-based systems, getting back to this rule-based stuff, it's really interesting how over a long enough timeline, people will figure out ways to weaponize the system to use it to their advantage. And that's the stuff that you have to be careful of. And they'll use it under the guise of reason and logic. And they'll say, well, you know, if you look at this from a scientific perspective, I'm like, well, yeah, that's great, but that only applies to a subset of something that we can possibly evaluate. What about all the multiplicative interactions in the future that we could possibly run into? And I think that the same reoccurring theme is always driving, which is you have to be very cautious about having too much confidence in man-made systems. Even if they're righteous to start out with, they emerge over time and people figure out ways to kind of rig the system. And this rigging of the system is where the real problems begin, because people are embedded in the system. They figure out, oh, I can do this and manipulate it in such a way that I can actually gain an advantage. And that's really where everybody expects everybody to play by the rules. But the simple fact is there's just a good portion of people that figure out how to weaponize the system and use it to their advantage. And I think that's what we're all kind of pointing out, is you just have to be cautious of, people, mandating or imposing their righteousness onto you, and be very skeptical of those things.
Wait, so Paul, you're saying I can't go see my mistresses? Are you saying that I'm not allowed to see my mistresses while everybody's in lockdown? Is that what you're saying?
You're welcome to do whatever you want. I'm just saying that you have to be very cautious of the people that want to impose rules and regulations. They're not always doing it for righteous reasons. And even corporations or science or anything else, is when you have these very man-made structured environments, they can be weaponized, and you have to be very cautious of that weaponization. Very similar to the peer review stuff that you're referring to, right? That gets weaponized somehow. Guys figured out how to manipulate that system, and once they figure out that formula, they're going to use it to their advantage.
So
knowing everything we know about the COVID pandemic, how do you think we will react to the next pandemic as a whole? And how do you think we should react to the next pandemic?
Mr. Driver, you want to go first on this one?
No, you go first. You go first for a change. Let's mix it up. Then I can copy what you said.
That's fine. My sense is people are going to be a lot more skeptical. They're going to, because I think one of the things that this, everybody was bought into the program. Okay, well, I guess I'll go along with what they're trying to impose on us. And I think that one of the things that people initially were was like, oh, I'll do whatever they kind of tell me to do. I just think there'll be a lot more skepticism, in particular to the mandates. And I think that people will push back a little bit more than they did before and be a lot more leery of being forced to do something for the good of the people, because at the end of the day, they kept changing the story as the information started coming out. And then they're like, well, that's science. I'm like, no, you guys promoted it as these are absolutes. We're guaranteed. We know everything there is to know. And instead of saying, hey, listen, we're not really sure about this thing, so this is what we're going to try to do. But they didn't do that. They always made it sound like, hey, we're the scientists and we're the politicians. We know what's best for you. So shut the hell up and take the medicine and do what you're supposed to do. And that's where I get a little bit aggravated, is that weaponizing science, weaponizing your status or your level of influence in a way that forces other people to kind of go down a road that we just didn't really know about. So I think at the core of all this is people will be a lot more, they'll push back more and they'll be more skeptical going forward.
I don't think there'll be another pandemic, however this last one came about or whatever it was. I think there's a new show playing at the theatre now, so I think that will be mostly memory hold, I think. So there's a new show. They weaponized the science. I don't think we've seen the end of the weaponizing of science, but I think they're weaponizing something new now. So they're weaponizing virtue in the shape of this kind of fake compassion. So I don't see. I think we will have a series of crises, but I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be a pandemic. So I don't think that's something we're going to have to deal with. But the new con or the new show, the new theatre show, right now it's weaponizing the sort of climate change debate or whatever that is. It's sort of they're doing something quite interesting with war. So war now is a compassionate act. Apparently, it's good for the environment as well, if you believe these people. So I don't think we're going. I don't think they're going to run another pandemic on us. I think they're running the next psychological operations now. So those really are around three things. I think they're around the environment, they're around identity, and they are around the virtues of war. So I don't think there's room right now for them. I don't think they particularly need to run another pandemic past us. So I think they're busy with those three things. So you're seeing, if you like, the second order effects of those particular operations in terms of the energy prices in Europe at the moment, which are interestingly, 2 out of the 3 of those, the games that are being played at the moment, are going to achieve the end of destroying sort of independent business. So you don't need to be a conspiracist. Perhaps some of this sounds like conspiracy theory, but you don't need to be a conspiracist. You just need to follow the money. And at the end of the chain of war in the Ukraine, at the end of the chain of net zero, is a shift, a dramatic shift of all commercial transaction going from the small to the very large, and I think that certainly seems to be what is being attempted at this stage. So I don't expect to see another pandemic. I think a controversial belief. I think pandemics are created one way or another. Whether they are created in labs, I've got severe doubts about that, or whether they are created by overreaction and panic. I think that's probably more closer to the truth. But I don't think we'll see that now. I think we are in the midst of three different games, and those games I think at the moment are proving to be quite successful. It's going to be very interesting to see how this energy crisis plays out, and we're interested to see whether populations that did submit to the most incredible surrendering of freedom, of logic, of their body autonomy and integrity, whether those populations are now going to submit to lights off and the destruction of the local economies. How much more can populations submit themselves to? Well, I think we're about to find out. I think that's very uncertain at the moment. So that's my. I don't see another pandemic coming. I largely agree with Paul. I think if another one did come, I think people are done with lockdowns. I think most sensible people realise now that they cause far more harm than I don't think there was any good. They were just harmful. And I think people are becoming more resistant, perhaps. Certainly large swathes of the working classes, the blue collar classes, I don't see them submitting again to another product from the pharmaceutical industry without there being much more thorough and long-term testing. So I think that bit of the show's over, but I think we were only on the first chapter, and I think we're dealing with a whole different set of problems now. So that would be my view.
It's very interesting, Mike. And what I gathered from listening to both of you and from my own observations is I've always heard of the concept of a banana republic, but I guess we've now seen a banana pandemic. And one of the interesting elements of it, as Paul was talking, I realized something very interesting as Mike was talking about, what if I'm the CEO of Pfizer or the CEO of Company X? For the very longest period of time, these companies have created world-class marketing departments. And a part of their marketing budget is the lobbying that goes with it. And they've become a force to reckon with. And we've seen that because universities get whole wings built, quote unquote, for research. It's funded by the same people. Doctors obviously just prescribe things, not all of them, obviously, a specific percentage. But what you start to notice is if they take control of the levers where those people are graduating from, and they start to convince those people that the only solution to any kind of sickness is pharmaceutical intervention, and you get a generation of doctors trained that way, and you get another generation brought up who only think that science can only be done if there's peer review and nothing outside of peer review exists. What you start to do there is you detach thought from nature, because you're no longer testing in the lab. What you're doing now is testing a paper against another person saying that's a good paper, right? That's sort of the problem that we're starting to witness. And the other element of it that sort of surprised me was to witness the depth and scale of the intermingling of these different systems. For example, it was my understanding, since I came to Canada as a kid when we were watching it, and I remember this because when we came from Afghanistan, my dad used to tell me that in Afghanistan, you couldn't rely on the news because the news was essentially talking for the government. But at least in the West, the news is talking for the people against the government to hold them accountable. And what we noticed during the last couple of years is that the media is the spear, and the spear is aimed at the people. There's literally pieces you can find where they're saying, "Oh, I'm done with these people who don't want a flu shot. If you don't want to participate in society, I could care less if you show up at the hospital and you're dying. I won't treat you." And these are doctors talking, and the people who are echoing these points of view are quote unquote journalists who are saying, "Yeah, it's okay that you just discarded the Hippocratic Oath. We're cool with that." So I watched this. I'm like, wow, the government, some of the members of whom are clearly indebted to the people who are donating to them. The entire muscle architecture and system that the pharmaceutical companies have developed is to be pushing these ideas out. Every time you watch the news, brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by, ask your doctor about this particular medication. Those guys got in bed early and pushed the message through the media, and they pushed the government regulators, so to speak, to fall in line. And what made it scary was there was only one country that actually actively dissented, a Western country called Sweden. They actually dissented, which was surprising. I'm like, how come they didn't get those guys? What happened there? So that we need to actually investigate that. And compound all that with some of the people who we thought were very smart, intelligent, mathematically oriented type people, and they made the same mistake. I remembered there was a moment I was listening to a particular person talking, and he said, let's extrapolate this based on the mathematical model of X, Y, and Z. And he just started extracting. And it's kind of like, I realized as soon as that happened, something very strange happened to me. I watched it, and I remembered going into a business meeting a few years earlier where I was pitching to a VC, and he asked me, what's your business model look like? And I sort of showed him, oh, well, here's some of our track record, and here's what we think where we're going with projections. And he immediately said, stop. He goes, your projections don't mean anything here. What I need to see is what actually happened. And as soon as I saw the quote unquote infection rates exponentially being extracted, I immediately remembered that VC who was talking to me. And he said, stop. What you're doing here could be fairy tale because the error that you're building into that model, and because it's exponential, it'll take off in a direction that there's no way anybody could predict. And more than likely it's wrong. And that's where that humility comes into play. And so I witnessed all of that, and I started to see the corruption tied into multiple layers. And as I've been listening to the two of you talk, I realized one of the things that corruption does, whether unknowingly or unwittingly, is that it allows you to hide information. So that information loss, that problem what we were originally discussing, gets amplified because now there's incentive to hide that information as well. So you have loss through abstraction, now you have loss through coercion. So it's sort of a double whammy situation. And so what that leads us to believe is that as soon as a coordinated message, the first thing you should really look for is the dissent, because actual science, real debate, business models all have dissent. In essence, business models are built on dissent. Oh, your company sells pizza like this. Well, my company sells pizza like this. That's dissent. It's not the same like, oh, well, we're all going to sell it the same way. No, that wouldn't work. The market works because dissent is available to be produced. When the market is centralized, there is no dissent. So my antenna, as has been sharpened by both Paul and Mike, has been tuned to looking for dissent. And I'm starting to notice that the entirety of the structures of power, whether it's media, whether it's government, whether it's tech, what they've done is they've made dissent such a hostile thing that they've hollowed out those institutions. And the people who you really want in those positions for the next big problem that shows up, they're not going to be there anymore because they were shown the exit, sometimes forcibly. So I'll pass that mic back over to Paul to ask him to think about what happens to those interactions across time when you've hollowed out a system of signal, and all you've done is a place where a specific category of bandwidth of noise can be amplified.
Yeah, you're running into a reoccurring theme in all of these things, and that is this. Things like science, which is supposed to be this idea of something pure where we don't really try to prove, we falsify, and so forth and so on. And what we realized is, in particular, is this idea of how does something like that get weaponized in a system? And that's where the real skepticism should begin. Is people will take something that is supposed to be genuinely clean, like science or religion, and they'll weaponize it, and they'll figure out ways to manipulate it to get the outcome that they really want politically or financially or something along those lines. So they'll figure out a way to optimize using something pure and clean like science and say, well, it's scientific. It should be clearly obvious that we use scientific procedures. And they use this slight nuance by saying, well, it's science. So if we're using science, we proved this. And they kind of do this kind of bait and switch thing where they're like, everybody knows science is about falsification, but when it's weaponized, they allude to the fact that, well, we're using science so that we proved our point. And the simple fact is, you've proved up to a particular, or you've looked at a particular set of data, but we haven't unleashed that set of data in the multiplicative environment. And that's when the real harm begins. So I'll keep going back to the idea that the number one problem we're running into, whether or not it be information loss or knowledge-based stuff or any of those things along those lines, we have to keep in mind that it's not, the problem isn't of being right or wrong. It's it's the weaponization of people in modernity and how those things can really work against the system. And that's really what my big alarm bell is, or that's my biggest concern is, we're taking things that like mathematics and probability and we're weaponizing them, and science and religion and things of these natures, and we're figuring out ways to use them against people. And that's what that's my big kind of focus is, the information loss is extremely important and those things are crucial. But the bigger issue is, or to me, the bigger issue is, how do the things that we consider to both be structurally pure and logically and reasonably clean, how do those things get weaponized in the political environments? How do they get weaponized by corporations? That, to me, is the bigger fundamental problem. Is that's when the real harm begins. That's how we create fat tails, in my opinion, is that's what we run into. So that's kind of how I look at this whole thing with the conspiracy stuff. I mean, what George Carlin say, right? Conspiracy. If interests align, you don't need a formal conspiracy or something like that. And it's the same reoccurring theme. Is it's about trying to get people to think a particular way about a particular situation. And that's where I start to go, hey, be cautious of that. I'm not saying don't go down that road. I'm just saying you have to, that's the alarm bell. That just be aware of that. And that's my biggest concern, is the weaponization of these devices that man has created, both from a reason and logic standpoint, like science, mathematics, and probability, and how do they get weaponized?
I think I have a theory for you guys to think about how they have become weaponized, or how the power has shifted. So I think there's a growing realization that daily life is overshadowed on almost every level by the internet complex, if you like. So the digital services that used by people everywhere are subordinated to the power of the corporations, the intelligence agencies, cartels, and the psychopathic billionaire class. So I think that to me that feels like the methodology, and this billionaire class, these transnational corporations, they're on a rampage of planetary looting and destruction, and they dress it up lots and lots of other ways. Children. Where did children learn from now? I think they probably learn more vocabulary from a machine than they do from their mothers. So I think this internet complex, or this connection that everybody has to have to the phones, the screens, the digital tools, I think that is the media by which this is the media of the how that Paul's talking about, I think.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Michael. I think that this optimization of technology has squeezed the humanity out of life, so to speak. You run into these things where the optimization factor of technology in relationship to the humanity, that gets lost. And so the more the simple fact is, the more you connect technologically, the more you fragilize the humanity of human interaction. That's why when you talk to people sometimes and you go to have a conversation with them, they almost short circuit. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to interact because they haven't developed those skill sets. And so I think that's to the point of Michael was making, is we've squeezed the humanity out of being human with these technological advancements. And again, we're getting back to this idea of this reoccurring theme of when you optimize the benefit, something like connections through networks, you fragilize something else. And most of the time, what you're fragilizing is what makes us human. It removes that part of it. And I think that's my big alarm bell, or that's the thing that scares the tar out of me is the more we're connected, the more we're actually becoming emotionally disconnected from being human.
I think it's I think what they're doing is intuition is a threat to them. To go back to my original point, intuition is a threat to this. They don't want that. They're trying to create a world that's based on administrative procedures, power of technology, belief in the abstract, if you like, over the embodied. Humans, they're reductionist. And the power of intuition, the strength of intuition is something that needs to be destroyed, I think. But I think where that leaves humans is that I think we've got a planet of traumatized people. I think people know something's wrong. That life feels unsatisfying and it feels incomplete. And I think that the way I'll call them the billionaire class for want of a different terminology, is their strategy to deal with that is to keep manufacturing crises. So to go back, I don't think people feel comfortable in the world that Paul describes. I think they instinctively and intuitively feel that something's wrong, but it's very difficult to express that intuitive human feeling if you're running into one crisis after another. And I think that's sort of circles back to what I was saying before about our three new crises that we've had manufactured for us now. The creation of alarm, or the creation of crises, and the creation of fear is big business. It pays well.
100% on that front. What I was going to just interject real quick to give a little context to it, to just wrap up Mike and Paul's point, is as follows, right? So if you think about music, think of music as liquid architecture, and think of architecture as frozen music. And if you go back to, anybody who visits Italy will tell you have to go and take a look at the great art that's around there, the sculptures, the paintings. And you walk around these days and you notice that modern art is anything but that, right? And if you listen to really great music, there's a layer of rebellion built into it. You listen to the music that's out there now, that's all been squeezed out of it. So to bring it back to Mike's point of view, if you squeeze the human out of the person, you end up with a hollow person who will willingly disconnect with their own family members based on what they heard on the internet or based on what they heard on the news. That's very alarming. I don't think that's ever happened in history. I don't think people understand the gravity of the situation where you take a person and you weaponize them against their own family or their own friends. Or worst case scenario, you have people who plead and cry about the fact that they couldn't visit a loved one who was told live in a hole for the last aspect of your life because flatten the curve, and that person died and they weren't allowed to be visited. Meanwhile, the people who were imposing these rules were having parties. Now, that the level of anger and rage that creates, that's going to have a nasty side effect when it boomerangs backwards. And similarly, the people you've hollowed out, that's a temporary Pyrrhic victory. And what I mean by that is what you're going to have is that person's going to wake up one day and they're going to realize that they were lied to, that they cut off the wrong people, that they trusted the wrong people, and now they're going to want to take their vengeance and aim it in a particular direction. And that direction might not necessarily go in the direction that people think it will go. It might go completely against the quote unquote billionaire class, the ruling class, because that type of fomenting of hatred is actually, to give the best word for it, is it's evil. Because think about it. Life is nothing but about relationships. And I don't know this as a person who sits down in front of 3 monitors writing code all day, but everything I do is in service of humans who use whatever tools I build. And I think about this point of view from your entire life. If you just map out the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever lifespan you have in front of you, the only thing that really matters is the relationships you have. Who are your friends? Who's your family? How big is your family growing? What kind of value are you bringing to those people? What kind of people those people are turning into? That's what it's all about. And if you start to sever those value ideals, what kind of a society are we really going to create? And so I think that the harm and the direction that we're going in that way, as per Mike's concerns for the next theater of this particular show, is the dehumanization was step one. And step two, as we clearly see it, is, let's forget that Ernest Hemingway wrote A Farewell to Arms about the horrors of war. Let's, once again, lionize a war. For what? So somebody explained to me how we went from A Farewell to Arms to everybody put on a Ukraine flag on their Twitter bio. I don't know how that happened. Maybe you guys do.
I think the internet's wiped everyone's memories. Was it Rilke? You'll know this. I always get it wrong. Is it Rilke who said singing is being? On your point of architecture is frozen music.
I believe it was Rilke. Yes, and he said, live to the point of tears, and those lessons are forgotten so quickly. I
can't do this in German. You might be able to do it in the German, but didn't he also say you must change your life?
It all depends on who the person is, what the tone and incantation of that particular message is. Because what I wanted to bring back to you, Mike, was let's imagine a different scenario for a second. Let's imagine that there is another pandemic. Let's imagine it's a real pandemic, and let's imagine that the voices that are allowed to be amplified constantly are the voices of actual dissent. What would a world look like in an ideal situation where the people who are allowed to speak are multiple camps of dissent, and each camp has its own particular point of view? And what would that allow us to create as a humanity, as a whole? That's what we are always striving for. That's why we start businesses. It's like, I have a different point of view. Let me see if that light that I put on this hill draws enough to it. But we're seeing it in a different way, in the sense that, to Mike's point of view, it's not necessarily science that's wrong. It's who's telling you what the science is. I mean, we literally had a person, Dr. Fauci, claiming he was the stand-in for science. Say what you want about vaccines and COVID and lockdown, whatever, but even the most diehard fan has to stop for a second and say, wait a minute, did he just say those words? Did he just say that he is science? And nobody questioned him on that. Nobody pushed back on that. Nobody said, whoa, whoa, whoa. The level of arrogance and dishonesty and the rot within you that enabled you to utter those words, that's your shadow speaking in Jungian terms. Something is deeply corrupt with that person. Even if that's a talking point that somebody handed to him, he should have just looked down on that. I'm not saying that sentence. You need to go back and fix this. But he said it with conviction. He said it with deep belief. He said it with sincerity, and nobody pushed back on it. So that state of the broken world is perfectly reflected in the fact that that was allowed to be uttered, that was suggested to be uttered, that was uttered with conviction, and more importantly, nobody challenged it. And it takes a couple of guys on a podcast nobody really hears about. I understand the facts of it. We're not famous for this, but we just like these conversations. We're the ones asking this question. Why is it that it's okay that somebody was able to claim that title for themselves?
What you're talking about there, Ace, is the classic decentralization, centralization issue, isn't it? So, if you had multiple voices of dissent and lots of people contributing, you would have a number of alternative solutions. Obviously, the situation that we've ended up in is this, centralization, which is the inexorable path towards a point of failure, isn't it? So I think what you're describing is the difference between centralization and decentralization. The idea that there is one path, irrespective of context, is a vortex, isn't it? And drags us all over the edge. So I think what would a world look like? It would look like a world where we didn't completely fragilize ourselves. We stood on one playing card, basically a single point of failure. So I think that's it. There seems to be this incredible drive, or it's almost like you can't debate this drive towards the centralizing, that everything has to be handled on a worldwide basis. But there seems to me to be a road to complete ruin. We're literally putting everything on red. So I think the world that what would the world look like that was the opposite to this? It would be a world where we had multiple points of failure and multiple solutions to issues as they come along, and that's how we survive. Serial redundancy, which I'm not going to talk too much about because that's on the other podcast, but we survive with multiple points of failure. The minute you've got one single point of failure, ruin's just around the corner, isn't it? Fate arrives in the form of Mike Tyson and punches you in the face. So I think that's what you're describing, is that classic dichotomy. I don't know what you think, Paul.
Two things. I'm going to jump back for a second to when you were talking about intuitive and how technology has kind of destroyed that part of it. And the one thing I'd like to say on that is you see it in the symptoms, right? You see people's anxiety start to go exponential. You see disconnects. You see all these strange things that have never occurred in humans all of a sudden start popping up left and right. People are going, everybody needs a psychologist, psychiatrist, they need to be on drugs and so forth and so on. So you're definitely seeing, even if people, this is the interesting thing, is sometimes people can't articulate what's happening. We just see it in the effects, in the symptoms that start to occur. And one of the things that we're seeing on a regular basis is that anxiety skyrocketing at every level, both from the very young age to the very adult, is this symptoms permeating through every facet of one's life. The other, to the topic that you guys are discussing now, it's the weaponization of the expert, right? It's the hey, listen, you guys sit back, let me tell you how this game is played. I'm the expert, and nothing makes me go more parabolic than when people try to impose their expert analysis on, hey, you don't know what you're talking about. I do. I've studied this for years. And it gets back to this idea of it works in the bounded and compact spaces. These are experts in academia and politics and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, we're dealing in multiplicative, multidimensional spaces. So I'm going to keep harping on this idea that that's where the real problem is you're an expert up to a point, but you could be wrong. And the problem that I have an issue with is, this gets back to the weaponization of science, is they're imposing these ideas onto people saying, listen, you have no idea, you're totally ignorant, you have no idea, and you shouldn't even have a conversation, you shouldn't even have a seat at the table. And that is where the real problems start to begin, is when we start believing that knowledge-based systems encompasses all knowledge. And the simple fact is, it doesn't. And in fact, you can make an argument that knowledge-based analysis and knowledge-based information is infinitesimal to the total knowledge of the system. And what we really know is very infinitesimal, and we go to weaponize that, and that's when problems start to really occur, and that's when we start to see fat tails. So it's this underlying theme of the expert, that they know all. It's Wizard of Oz stuff where, hey, don't pay attention to the guy behind the screen, because we don't, all that really matters is he knows how to apply this. And I think that's really what has occurred over the last 3 or 4 years, is this idea of the expert knows all and don't question him. And the moment that starts to happen, I just think you have a real problem.
I think it's interesting, because I think you can take it even a step back and think about the way in which the expert attends to the world, and that seems to be sort of explicit, instrumental, defined, confident, this abstract voice that becomes the only voice that we ever hear. While the alternative to that, I guess, is the intuitive, implicit, fluid, intrinsic sort of maverick voice. I've been trying to get the term maverick out there to describe us, because it makes us sound cool. that voice is diminished and irrelevant. So it seems that we've, if you like, we've put on a pedestal a particular way of attending to the world that breaks things down into bits, that makes things a function of each other, and they can only be understood in relationship to each other. So nothing's ever understood in its relationship to the whole. It's only ever understood in its relationship to another thing. And so all the analysis that they do is some kind of translation. So it's somehow removed or separated from reality. And that is the voice that comes through the screen. It is that screen that separates you from reality, that separates you from your own intrinsic, inherent, intuitive nature. And I think that's where I think that's what's kind of driving people mad, is somewhere inside they know a whole portion of themselves has been nullified. It's probably what's driving you mad with the expert class. You're not allowed to listen to your own intuitive senses. You have to listen to this abstract, disembodied, screen-based, hugely confident, hubristic voice, which is just, it's everywhere. That way of attending to the world, that attitude is, we're almost besieged by it. I think as humans, and I go back to it again. I think we are a planet, or certainly those couple of billion, or between 1 and 2 billion who are connected. We are a planet of traumatized people, and I agree with you, Paul. People feel this deep sense of dissatisfaction, and it comes out in all kinds of weird and crazy ways. I think that one of the reasons that we all kind of kept a conversation going for years now is that we treat each other with grace. That is a very difficult thing to find outside of your immediate family, and even people even find it difficult there. What happened to grace? Grace seems to be the thing, one of the other things that seems to be eliminated alongside, the intuitive sense of human beings. Everyone seems to have lost that. Grace, I guess, is a harmony with the universe, isn't it? That would my definition is. And what we seem to have at the moment is a world of disharmony. So I agree with you. I think what we're both getting at here is this world of traumatized people.
Yeah, and just one thought on that is grace, humbleness, not knowing, being comfortable with that, and the moment, and I chat about this a little bit, but one of the things that drives me absolutely bonkers is the idea of, if you cannot question it, and you're not allowed to say, well, I don't really know about that, and I'm not really sure, or hey, the problem hasn't emerged yet. You think but you have, that's one of the things with nature is, the problem may not have emerged yet, and you're manipulating something, and you're saying, well, I've solved that problem. I'm like, yeah, but you might have created 25,000 other issues based off your own solution, and so you're making solutions of a problem that now, but nature's going to come along and come up with 19 different ways of it's going to work around that, and that's the problem that I have with these guys is this idea of, if you cannot question it, if I can't say, well, yeah, but I don't really, that may be true, but there may be a problem that we have not yet seen yet. And that's the problem that I have is that people aren't allowed to question. And more importantly, they use their stature or to impose or mandate how they see the world. And I'm like, oh, so you can't be wrong? They're like, well, I've studied this for 25 years. I'm like, that doesn't mean that you're right. And more importantly, nature can come along create a problem on top of your solution that you can't get out of. Very similar to like antibiotic resistant stuff, right? We're starting to see boundaries as far as that's concerned. So that's kind of the stuff that I go, just nuts over. It drives me insane that these guys are. I'm like, you realize when you create a solution, you may have created more problems that are that don't have solutions to them, and that's the part that I have, or that's the only thing I that people don't really discuss enough is, they assume they have all the information there possibly is about the state space, and I'm like, well, with nature you really don't know, because it still is and I think it's back to your continuous discrete thing, right? This idea of since it's always continuous, there's never a stopping point. Most people think of it as a game, right? Well, I've won the game, or I've got a solution, and in nature the game never stops, and in never stopping, that makes for a very difficult thing to navigate, and you just have to be careful of your solutions. But the bigger point is, if you can't question it, that's the real alarm bell. You can't question religion, you can't question science, you can't question the expert. I'm like, that to me that's the red flag.
I think to us, what we don't know is far more important than what we do know. There's a great line from, I always like to do a Merwin quote. There's a great line from Merwin where he says, "I have with me all that I do not know. I have lost none of it." And I think that kind of summarizes, we're always afraid of what we are missing. We're always afraid of what we don't know. It probably takes us all the way back to Ace's question of why I was suspicious in March, maybe even February 20, April 20, because always suspicious of what we don't know, always worried about what we don't know, always worried about the unknown. And I think that's lost. I can't think of a political leader in the world who is concerned about what they don't know. That seems to be lost. And
with that in mind, there's no money in announcing you don't know. And this gets back to the state-space optimization of all the money is in telling other people what to do and how to do it. So that is although most people don't discuss this, that's the problem with state-space optimization or payoff spaces. Most people are trying to monetize certificates or expert nature. There's no money in saying, well, I don't really know. People don't want to hear that. They want to hear, well, what's the answer? And the simple fact is that puts us into a Kobayashi, right? It's a non-winnable situation where you cannot, because you're trying to optimize the state space, which is some monetary payoff space, that puts you at a disadvantage, because there are times where you should just say, you know what, we really don't know. Through COVID, it should have been more along the lines of, hey, listen, we're not really sure how this is going to go about, but this is kind of the best thing that we think. But they don't want to do that. They want people to feel like that there's 100% they have 100% confidence level of exactly what to do, and they never came across like that. And they weaponize science, they weaponize the expert, and they weaponize the monetary payoff space. And I just have always have a real issue with that, is this weaponization of these payoff spaces and people, and being more comfortable with being humble about not knowing.
So the next question is going to be, what's worse, fragility or the hope sold on that fragility to the masses?
Well, I think that the larger the centralization, which is essentially the more people that believe the fragility, if you like, the worse it gets. So I guess the whole point of having multiple points of failure is that in and of itself, a fragile situation or a fragile thing isn't bad, can actually be quite good. So I wouldn't say that a situation or a thing characterized by fragility in and of itself isn't a bad thing. You actually want to go through quite a lot of non-terminal fragile events until you find the thing that works. So I think it really is the more people that buy the fragile solution, the worse it gets. That would be my answer, Paul.
I think with how I kind of think about fragility and fat tails and systemic issues is most of those things occur from the optimization of some benefit, optimization of some payoff space. And that's where the real fragility begins. So most people don't think in terms of, oh, that's fragile. They think in terms of, oh, well, that's good. Like getting an education. Most people don't realize at some point you're going to reach some type of upper limit where everybody's educated and there is no great return on that investment, but the costs keep going up. And so then you run into these bailouts and so forth and so on. So fragility doesn't, especially in fragility from man-made perspective, actually comes from the optimization of benefits. And that's where the fragility comes. So when people talk in terms of fragility, or the way I look at it is, it's never really sold as fragility. It's sold as a benefit. And we only see the fragility somewhere down the road. So at the end of the day, it's like when I think about those things, I don't think in terms of, oh, people are aware of the risk associated with this. What ends up normally happening is what ends up happening is that they optimize some benefit to a point of some upper limit or lower limit or boundary or whatever. And that's where the fragility begins. So I think to your question, I think the idea is be careful of people that promote optimization of some benefit as the only solution and only path, because at some point you're going to be bounded, and that boundary is where the fragility begins. And to me, that's the bigger issue is that society is always optimizing some benefit. Corporations, science, academia, they're all optimizing something for some type of compensation factor, and in turn, in doing that, they're creating fragility, even if you don't see it. Why? Because they're optimizing the monetary payoff space or some type of payoff space, and in optimizing that payoff space for a benefit, they're fragilizing the system. So that's to your point. That's kind of how I look at it. Is the fragility emerges from the optimization of benefits.
Yeah, and to riff off on the points that you guys just made, I like to think about nature in the sense that, okay, you have really beautiful antlers, the females are attracted. The bigger your antlers are, the harder it is for you to turn corners, which means the easier you are as a prey. So there's a balance in payoff space there. But to Paul's point of view, if you think about the education system, it's been weaponized and everybody's told you must get a degree. Now, there's a very important and distinct component that's always misunderstood, which is that you shouldn't look at life and make profit your only motive, but you should make profit a constraint of your decision-making processes. You want to go for impact first, and you want to constrain yourself to profit so that your losses don't become something that bleeds out to the rest of society. So I'll give you an example. Everybody's told, oh, go get a degree. Okay, so you get a loan, you get a degree, now you work at Starbucks. Now, you're miserable working at Starbucks because nobody appreciates your degree in English literature or whatever nonsensical degree you got yourself entangled with. And that same job would have been actually less stressful and less annoying if you had just gotten that job to start with. You would have been out of debt. You probably could have learned a thing or two about how to run a coffee shop. And eventually, with a little bit of time and savings, you probably could have opened your own coffee shop to serve a different need. And the problem we're seeing here is this idea that we're narrowing choice. And so it's the same concept of dissenting voices are not there. Everybody must become a lawyer, a doctor, or engineer, or an entrepreneur. It doesn't work like that. What you want to do is you want to say, serve humanity. So that's your impact point. Constrain that by profit. And what we mean by that is profit has to be not just monetarily, but your time, effort, energy, and your actual general happiness. If you hate your job, it's not profitable. Eventually, it'll catch up to you. But if you're a plumber and you get to make your own schedule, your work results are immediately visible to you, and you don't have a boss, you could come home whenever you want, you don't have to take the weekend shift. That's actually a much more palatable life than somebody with $400,000 in debt working at a coffee shop, feeling like they're too good to work at that coffee shop, having a level of condescension toward not only their their fellow employees, but also to the staff, to the customers of that business. So this whole fragilization concept is this idea that the only answer to the world is X, and somehow over the past 30 or 40 years, that answer has been go get a degree. Why? What's the benefit of that degree for me? I don't need the degree. Maybe not everybody should get a degree. In fact, now we're starting to see that degrees aren't worth the paper they're printed on. And so now you have to think about the second order effects of what happens to a world where everybody wakes up to that idea. So the next generation that decides that we're not going to buy in, and the previous generation that bought in are now buried in debt, there's going to be conflict there as well. There's going to be resentment. They're going to say, how come he didn't go? How come I went? Why am I in debt and he's not? Why am I serving him coffee and he doesn't? If you think about the scenario, the kid at 18 who decided not to go and spends a year even if he just spends a year being a complete free spirit, walking around doing nothing productive of value, he's still better off than that guy of $300,000 in debt because he lived on campus serving him that coffee. That level of resentment is going to start to build up, and it's going to show up in pockets all over society. You're starting to see it now. There's this resentment toward people who didn't take the vaccine from the people who did take the vaccine. It's kind of like, remember, we're talking about that game of information loss, but there's another layer to this, which is monkey in the middle, right? Everybody's in the playing a game. You got the media, you got academia, you got big tech, you got the government. They're kind of throwing this ball around, and people are just, oh, I need to lock down. Okay, they run over to the lockdown corner, and it didn't work. Oh, I need to wear a mask. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, I need to get a vaccine. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, I need to get a second vaccine. Oh, that didn't work either. So there's like you're just a little monkey just walking around. And in fairness to the rest of us, we're all just apes, right? At the end of the day, I'm an ape hosting a podcast. You guys are apes just trying to have a conversation. So we can give everybody that leniency, but on the other side of the equation, we have to look at what's happening here on the greater scale of things. Is there a hide the ball going on? Is there information loss happening? Is there a monkey in the middle game that's being played? And more importantly, the people who are playing that game are having fun, but they don't realize that life isn't just for their lifespan. But what happens to their kids' generation when they inherit a world so broken because all those adults that were supposed to be in charge completely dropped the ball. They broke all the trust. They broke thousands of years of familial ties because, like Mike said, you have a TikTok screen. So I'll pass that back over to Mike and get his thoughts on it, and then we'll go to Paul.
Well, I don't think it's. I agree with about 99% of what you said there, but I do wonder whether we can be a little bit sort of negative in assuming that it is going to end in that sort of desolate future. We have the universe that we live in tends towards beauty and complexity and order, and without getting religious, trying not to be religious, we can shrug our shoulders and say that just happens at random. But I'm not so sure. I like to think of the way things happen. I call it the pull. So it's quite a hard thing to explain, but I think that we are the way things progress. They're not pushed blindly forward by a mechanism from behind. Blind processes, can't see the future. And I think it's better to think of the way things happen as they are attracted towards certain goals or certain possibilities. So I sometimes, when you look back about when things have turned out really well, the route that you got there, if you'd have taken a discrete photograph or a discrete 5-minute interval along that way, it could quite often look very dark. But when you look back over your life, I certainly feel that things have a funny way of working out, and that's this midpoint, if you like, between possible and reality. Call it potential, if you like. I call it the pull. So I actually, although things look quite bleak currently, I actually think that the universe isn't sort of it doesn't favor this. It works against, if you like, this centralized top-down systemization, and I think that I think it's less likely that we're going to end up in this. I think we're at a in terms of volatility. We're at a bad moment, but it doesn't necessarily follow that that's the way things will end. So I think I have a little bit more optimism. Perhaps I think we've probably talked about all of the things that are wrong, if you like, or that drive us crazy, or that we're looking at. But if you look at the way nature unfolds around us, it has this tendency towards high levels of awareness. It has this tendency towards beauty, and this evolves over the trajectory of time. So I think I'm actually more optimistic than this conversation would probably indicate in a more general sense. I don't think we can fight that teleological arrow of the universe, or I don't think the billionaire class, whoever they are, they're fighting an impenetrable future, and the inevitability of the new, and we're not fighting that. So I actually think we're in a better position, even though we look like we're behind at the moment. That would be my initial response. I thought I would inject some optimism.
No, and you're spot on. I mean, I think one of the things that I talk to my kids, and I try not to help them too much with their problems, and let them, as I like to say, you'll figure it out. And I think we'll figure it out. And I also think that some of the things that we're seeing are very pendulum-like. They swing from one side to another, back and forth. And so you see these pockets, and if you take a snapshot of it, you're like, oh, geez, this looks like it's a dire situation. No, I'm in complete agreement with you on this, Michael. And I think that we're all kind of optimistic, because if we weren't, we would go into a room, shut the door, and never come out. I think that we're all of the belief, or hopefully we're of the belief, that things will work or figure their way out. I just think that one of the things that I get concerned with is this linearization of thinking, and that's pressed upon especially the young kids, right, through academia. Get good grades, so you can get a good job, so forth and so on. That's the part that's the one thing that kind of, for lack of a better term, drives me bonkers, is that kids are designed or forced to think a particular way, and this is the only way I would think. And so if anything comes out of this, hopefully it's a widening of perspectives, of allowing people to pursue things that that they're interested in, and not necessarily only one form of way of thinking. And I think that's the kind of reoccurring theme, is that we feel like the world's kind of closing in on us because we've been optimized to a particular path, right? Education, get a good education, get good grades, so you get a good job, so you can buy a big house or have a nice house, and so forth and so on. And I just think that what we're all kind of hinting at is there are other options other than the same path, or the same optimized path that everybody else is or modernity is purporting people to pursue. And I think that in doing that, I think a form of optimism comes out of that. I guess the optimism emerges from the volatility that eventually gets created from everybody following the same path. And they're like, wait a second, you guys told me that this was the best way to go, and it doesn't feel like it's the best way. And you get enough of those folks that feel that way, and they'll forge their own path, and that is a good thing, I think.
I 100% agree. And to bring it back to Mike's point about the optimization, or the optimism of looking at the universe through the lens of beauty, I attest to that on the following grounds. We can leave religion and God aside, but it's clearly visible with just two modern recent examples. So first example I'll give is just Steve Jobs, right? There's just one guy who showed up to a company that was about 90 days from bankruptcy and turned it around into the most profitable company that's ever existed. Now, are the engineers who work at Apple different and better than the engineers that work at Microsoft? I don't really think so. But there's something of a guiding force within what Steve saw, where he put an elevated beauty above everything else, and that gives a different kind of pull in a direction to the company. But to bring it to a second point, let's take a look at another example. I'm an NFL owner, Paul's an NFL owner, and Mike's an NFL owner, and Tom Brady's on the market. I would give my right hand to have that man show up. Even if we don't make the playoffs, I don't care about the playoffs. I want that mindset of that guy imprinted and embossed onto my stadium, into my janitor's mindset, into the guy who mows the lawn, and everybody else around it. Yet, when that man was available, only 2 teams showed interest. And I think what happened there was a bunch of people ran the numbers, did the data analysis, and said, yeah, he's probably past his prime, he's not worth it. But the one team that took the risk not only got rewarded handsomely because they won the Super Bowl, but more importantly, every single person associated with that organization during the tenure of Tom's that he's been there acquired a mindset of what a winner looks like. And the fact that somebody can so easily miss that, because you look at Tom, the last thing that comes to your mind is athlete. He's not an athlete. He doesn't look like an athlete. He doesn't fit the bill. He doesn't have 6-pack. He's not running faster than most of the people there. But it's not about that. There's something else that he brings to the table that speaks to the quality of truth and beauty. And I think that in a world governed by data, peer review, and I just need the analysis to be correct on this, sabermetrics for baseball, whatever the case may be, the fact that the entire NFL let that guy slide. I would take Tom Brady on his last year where he was injured and he couldn't play, but he just wanted to be around the team. I'd still take him, just because I know that I'm like, whatever he teaches us, whatever he brings to that table, we can work off of that, because clearly he knows something the rest of us don't know. This man single-handedly has more Super Bowl wins than entire franchises do. And I noticed the third thread, and I'll pass the floor back to you guys, is I was listening to one of the greatest UFC fighters in history, Khabib Nurmagomedov, and he was just telling people, he's like, here's my secret. He said, when I put you on the ground, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys, they're all trying to grab you in positions with their arms or whatever. What I do is I squeeze you with my thighs. And you're like, okay, what benefit is that? Well, they talked to his heavyweight training partner, and he said, when Khabib's on top of you, it feels like there's a heavyweight on you. Because when he's squeezing you with his thighs, you're gasping for air. And you notice this if you watch the fight with him and Conor McGregor. As soon as he mounts Conor's face looks like he's drowning. And it's not because Khabib is grabbing him with his arms or anything, but he's squeezing with his inner thighs so hard around Conor's ribs that Conor can't breathe. And if you put anybody in the world, no matter how top class they are, the minute they can't breathe, all their accomplishments, all their capabilities goes right out the window. And now they're in a state of panic, and you could take advantage of it. And so the guy went 29-0 for a reason. There are people who are specially built, and they come from a different breed, and they're a reflection, in my opinion, of that source of truth that religion tries to build a church around. And these people do exist. And yeah, you could say, the odds of, like, you could walk into any junkyard tomorrow, and you would have enough parts there to build a Ferrari, because it's just matter, right? However, we all know in reality, there's no way you're going to walk into that junkyard and watch a tornado self-assemble a beautiful Ferrari. That element of what creates that beauty, which is what Mike was hinting at, is constantly missing in our world. And there's this, I noticed this weird trend where we idolize people in the past, but we never really worship the work that's being put in the present moment. There's nobody that we look forward to today. Everybody, well, that's not Einstein. Einstein was, he's a giant in intellect. Yeah, but there's more people doing science now. I'm sure there's somebody as capable working today. But our entire cultural point of view has been such to diminish the current work and to only revel in the past. And the answer to that, the antidote to that, is what Mike is always talking about. It's the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the person who sees that, hey, you know what? I'm going to go try to make something out of this. Maybe it'll work. And if it does, maybe it'll be brilliant. And if it's not brilliant, at least it'll give me enough room to be my own boss. So the optimism is built in, but we can still see evidence of the fact that 30 teams passed on Tom Brady. So I'll pass it back over to Mike and get his thoughts on that.
Well, I think that you're looking at the team that didn't pass, or the examples that you've given are where people rather we go all the way back to the beginning. So rather than using a list of tick boxes to assess or analyze something, they're trying to look at things contextually. So I think that's, trying to look at things in terms of the whole rather than the individual constituent parts. Things are precisely of themselves and not another thing. no two blades of grass are the same. So that the idea perhaps that we can scientifically analyze Tom Brady it's crazy. But there is another way of attending to the Tom Brady problem, isn't there? And that's to contextualize Tom Brady in your particular environment, which is what you're doing there. And it's again this distinction between analysis and intuition. Intuition allows you to processes far more information if you think about it. It allows you to process the great sea of uncertainty, whereas the analytic view of Tom Brady only measures how fast he can run, or how his statistical performance has declined into his advancing years. It doesn't understand the effect that Tom Brady has on the whole. So it only looks at the effect that the facets of Tom Brady. So I think it's a really good microcosm of what we've been talking about on this call. I'll hand over to Paul here because I know nothing at all about American football, and Paul knows everything about American football. So I'm going to pass that.
No, neither do I. One thing that I want to kind of jump over to is religion and science, and that is this. I think a lot of times we look at them and we're like, well, one doesn't fit in the other, or the other one doesn't fit in one. Religion you can't prove that God exists, or science, or you can't use science in religion context. And I have finally realized, for me, the way I look at them is they can be mutually exclusive, meaning like they're both tools for different operations. Science can be used in evidence-based analysis, and religion can be used for the unknowing, or getting comfortable with unknowing. And so in using religion with science, you can say, okay, now I can get comfortable with not knowing a particular outcome. It just, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is that they can be used simultaneously, but you don't need to. One doesn't have to necessarily prove the other, and they can literally be two separate tools. So I've always had a struggle with that, as far as can you prove God exists? And the answer is maybe the great thing about religion is you don't have to. Why do we have to kind of go down that road? So I've been thinking about that one lately, and you mentioned religion, and that kind of popped up. The other thing is, I think a great example of all this, or this conversation that we're having, is how you arrive at particular decisions. And what we can all see is we may have different words and different perspectives but we all kind of go down a very similar path. Not the exact same path, because we all have had different experiences. With going down these different paths that we have, it brings a different perspective. And I just have found it very interesting that we can all look at some different situation and draw our own conclusions, but they're all very similar. Whether or not it be optimistic, or science, or conspiracies, or how to look at the world in relationship to one thing or another. And as far as sports are concerned, it's always the simple. To me, when it comes to sports, is I look at it a lot differently than I used to. I used to be a very structured, linear thinker in the form of how do I optimize some particular state space. As I've gotten older, I've gotten away from that, so I don't have a very dogmatic perspective that I once had, whether or not it be trading or sports. And one thing I've realized with sports is the simple fact is, a lot of times what makes somebody really successful are the intangibles, the things that aren't. It's all of the characteristics combined make that person special, and their particular path makes them extra special. And I just think a guy like Tom Brady, he just has intangibles. does he make people feel more comfortable? And the answer is, I don't know what it is. I just know that he seems to win a lot, just like Stephen Curry. He seems to win a lot. Whoever comes around in his orbit, and so when I start to look at those things, I don't try to break them down. I just accept them as, hey, you know what? That guy's got a gift. I don't know what the gift is, but it's something special, and it probably isn't something I can measure. And I think this gets back to the idea of be careful what you can measure, because at the end of the day, you may optimize something that you think is correlated to what you're measuring, and in reality, it may be a combination of all those characteristics along with the things that you cannot measure that makes that person special. And I don't think that's appreciated enough, especially in sports, because at the end of the day, we all want to look smart and feel smart. And so if we're like, well, I've got all the statistics that tell you that this should be true, and then you take that player and you put him on another team, and you're like, geez, that didn't work out. And the answer is because it goes back to this idea of it's about the multidimensional interactions that create a particular environment that makes that person special in that domain. And then if you move him over into something else, he's not that same person anymore because of the interactions. And so that's how I look at sports now versus I used to be very, like I said, dogmatic and analytical about, well, that guy's got this, this, and this. Now I'm like, well, especially at the uber levels, those guys that play at those elite levels, I don't know what it is. I just know that they just seem to have something special that is somewhat not reproducible. And that's how I look at that stuff.
No, and to build up on Paul's point of view, one of the things you notice if you watch some of the films that they made about Tom is not only does his team believe that they can still win, the other team is deathly afraid that they're facing Tom. And so it's kind of like this interesting compounding effect of it is you have this positive influence on your team that, we still have Tom and he could pull it off in the last minute. So that level of confidence to show up and make the plays is still there, even if you're playing from a position of deficit in terms of points that you need to score. But the other team is scared. And that's interesting, right? Because if you really think about that, these are grown men, these are professionals, these are elite level people, and yet they're afraid. And the same thing happens if you watch Khabib, right? He's in a fight. Those guys everybody's tough in that sport. Nobody's weak. Nobody's soft. Yet they get in the ring with the guy after one round, and every single one of them, they interview them after. They go, we know what he wants to do. He wants to grab you, he wants to push you against the fence, and then he wants to drag you. And I've trained for that. Yet they don't know what it feels like until somebody at that elite level does it. So it's almost like that whole saying is, yeah, I can beat a guy who does, kickboxing. Yeah, but you've never met the person who's the most elite at kickboxing. So you can't train for that guy. And so in essence, if you look at a person like Steve Jobs, to bring it back to him, is what he always said was intuition and beauty and art leads the way. Data informs that we're going in the right direction. It doesn't tell us the direction to start with. It just affirms and validates it and make adjustments for it. And the other companies do the exact opposite. They will A/B test and data drive everything to the point where they've missed the biggest plays that are out there. For example, Microsoft missed social. They missed mobile. They missed all those opportunities because their data told them that what they were currently doing was beautiful and correct. And in a way, you can't really blame them because, if you're making that much money, you're not really hungry and you're okay if the next meal isn't necessarily big for you because you've already been stuffed with billions in your pocket. So it leads in that particular direction of general complacency. But the idea of it all comes back to what happens with uncertainty. And our initial conversation that we started tonight with was simply this. You look at the future, you don't know what's waiting for you, and you're faced with a decision. And you're looking at a type 2 type error, which is, am I doing this so that I can be correct? Or am I doing this so I can minimize my harm? And the concept of profit attached to that would be as follows. Don't look at the short-term profit and ignore the long-term pain. But similarly, don't just look at the long-term profit and completely fall in the hole for the short-term work that you're going to have to put in to get that goal to meet. And it's that balancing act. And that's what Mike brings to the table from a business point of view. He looks at that and he says, okay, there's uncertainty. here's a type 2 type error that I have to deal with, and here are my constraints. But he's constantly informed by his love of poetry and his reading of English literature, and that's what people can't grasp.
I think there's a couple of other things that we do generally, as well as sort of minimizing harm. So I don't think we should be too. I think it's something that obviously the type 2 error is something that we do need to be focused on. But I do think there are other things that you can do, that we can do, that give us more chance of success. I mean, I think being too defensive, I think that's difficult. You tend to find the people who take slightly greater risks, but with flexibility, tend to be the winners in the end. So I think I've kind of left this bit out a lot when I've spoken about it before, because you don't want to lead people down a high risk path, and then they head to ruin. But the reality is, at some point, you kind of have to take the risk. And the people who do take those risks tend to be more successful in the end. And I think that those risks need to be informed by other things. So one of the best ways to take a risk is to take it when you're young. So it's not a good idea to wait around too long to start a business. I think that you've got a long way. You've got a lot of time to come back. If you take a risk on something and it fails, you've got plenty of time, if you take that risk when you're young, to do it again. Yeah, I think there does need to be an element of risk. So while you do minimize harm, I think if you're in your 20s, your 30s, you can take some bigger risks, because you can come back and you can do it again. And it tends to be, the species that sort of sacrifices defense for a bit more flexibility and a bit more movement, it tends to be the one that wins in terms of evolution. And I think that's similar. You want to be flexible, you want to be able to move, and you've got to be prepared to take some risks. So, but just take them when you're 25 and not when you're 55. Hard to come back when you're 55. So I'd say I'd add that into the mix. And I've kind of deliberately left that out. We've spoken before, and other things that I've spoken about. A lot of people have picked up on the first half of it and not picked up on the second half of it. It'd be quite interesting to see if people start to pick up on that after this podcast goes out. And the other thing I would say is that, life is, you mentioned music, and life is a dance. It's a celebration. It's like a gift, and it's not a mechanism that we can, or a mechanism to be exploited, or a problem to be solved. It's something else entirely. And I think we can sometimes, even when we speak, we can sometimes start to develop these almost, we become kind of rules based. Whereas the reality is life is something very different. And I think one of the things that I try to do is try not to separate business from life, and try and make it all the same thing.
So my final thoughts on kind of, the things that we've chatted towards the end, spinning off of what Michael was talking about, how I look at my particular perspective is, hey, just follow what if you're a risk adverse person, you're not going to be a risky person. And so one of the things I realized with trading was I had to trade the way I emotionally felt. My emotional alignment was to be not super aggressive. I was more of a counter trend trader than I was a trend trader. So that's how I was more aligned to. And as much as I might try to be a particular way, I'm not going to be that person. So I have always found it's pretty difficult to say, well, this is how you should probably do things to optimize that particular state space. I guess what I would hint at people or try to encourage people is, hey, just find whatever drives you, whatever kind of flicks your switch, whatever points you in a particular direction, and you feel emotionally motivated to do it, go do it. And you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to be errors, and you're going to you're going to have swings and misses and strikes out and so forth and so on. But if you are emotionally aligned to it, then go pursue it. And as far as the risk is concerned, you're never going to be able to optimize, or you're never going to be able to reduce it to zero. So just if whether or not it be a relationship or a business pursuit or anything, is, kind of go after what emotionally drives you. Go down the rabbit holes that you feel comfortable in going down. And that also kind of aligns to how I'm more of a random thinker. I'm all over the place. So it's very hard for me to have conversations now because I jump around so much. My mind is always like, I'm over here, over there. I can't remember what I just said 30 seconds ago. And so for me to have conversations now that I've been away from being in a structured environment like a work environment or sports environment, is very difficult because I can't keep my train of thought. I have almost become unbounded in the way that I think. It's almost like a Brownian motion thinking perspective. So that's the first half of it. The second half is, I think with COVID, you saw a great example of relationships really getting whacked, destroyed. So the things you thought were true weren't true, or you're like, man, I really misguided that. And all I can ever say about those things is very similar to having a group is, allow the hard part is allowing people to go down a particular path that you don't necessarily agree with, and being able to allow them to go down that path, even if you don't are not aligned to it. And I always say it's harder than you think it is, but it really is hard because you're like, geez, that's a real big mistake you're making. But I have found if you can find groups that allow you to free think and be able to disagree with them, but still allow them to share their perspective, is a very awesome, encouraging environment you want to create. So if you can figure out ways to share your thoughts in an environment where you can have diverse perspectives, because, just by us four all kind of bouncing ideas around, we can clearly see that everybody has different perspectives. And even if we don't agree upon, hey, I don't necessarily agree with that perspective or this perspective, I think this idea of having an environment to let those ideas emerge is incredibly useful. And those are my two prevailing thoughts that I kind of want to close in on. Is number one, just go pursue what you're interested in. Yes, there's going to be risk. Yeah, you're probably going to make mistakes, but still go down it. And the other thing is to figure out groups that will allow you to share your perspective and voice your opinions. And that system has to be allowed to disagree and still move forward. And I think those two things are the two final thoughts that I have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I'm just going to give the last question here to Em, and we'll get your thoughts on her wrapped up final question, which is going to put a nice bow on top of this box.
All right. So I think the closest you can get to a lie is absolute truth. What I mean by this is follows. Like evolution in nature, I think truth moves similarly. It always be space to evolve, to expand, or to grow. You can go as close to the truth as possible, but you cannot touch it. Absolutely. Similar to the painting by Michelangelo where he depicts Adam reaching for God. Adam's hand doesn't touch God's hand. There's a little space left between them, I think purposefully. I feel like absolute truth stops the seed of evolution. Recently, we've seen, especially in politics, leaders speak with absolute truth as their backbone. What do you think the impacts of this will be?
Mr. Driver?
I'm thinking, would you mind answering?
No. So here's, I think that we're running into the situation once again where we define something and then we try to fit into that definition. And I think truth is one of those things like love, is there's an abstract component to it that makes it very hard to get your arms around. And so instead of, because at the end of the day, you're never really going to know what the truth is. Is it because somebody tells you what's true? Well, even if it's true, are they withholding information that you may or may not know about? And then how does that emerge over time? So I think that you have to be, and again, this is my interpretation. I realize that there are some religious components where people are like, hey, they believe that this is absolute truth. And you know what? I think they should believe that, if that's how they want to define it. How I view it is, I am very cautious about things being true, absolute, bounded by a definition, and just say, you know what? I am now more on the side of, it's better if I just don't know, and look at the world more in terms of, not in terms of either absolute or truth, but just accepting, you know what? I probably don't even know. Even the stuff that I do know, that I have evidence of or facts or details on, you know what? In 30 seconds, those things all might be the complete opposite. And you kind of see this in price, where you're like, oh, this thing will never go down, and the next day, a stock will go down 50%, and you're like, wait, what happened? And what you thought was true wasn't true. So I think we run into a problem where we get hamstrung on trying to fit into what we believe to be true, and just instead of saying, hey, I just don't really know. So instead of trying to force myself into a definition of truth, I'm just going to be more comfortable with saying, you know what? I don't really know what true is. I don't really know what love is. It has different meanings at different times. What I thought was true I use this term all the time. How I saw the world 25 years ago isn't how I see the world now. Now, was it true then? Well, yeah, that's how I interpreted the world. Is it true today, even though I look at the world differently? Well, yeah, that's the truth that I know. So I am more cautious of thinking in terms of absolutes, in terms of, and I think this gets back to the continuous, discrete point that Michael made at the beginning of this conversation, which is, I'm more of the idea of the continuous allows us to never really know what is true and what is not true. But a more religious component would be allowing us to be comfortable with not knowing, and that's how I interpret truth and definitions and boundedness and stuff like that.
Okay, I think that everything Paul said, but I think that whatever truth is, I'm going to do the Keats thing because I did recently. Truth is beauty, but whatever it is it's constantly changing. It's constantly unfolding. It's constant. It's not something that it's almost impossible to hold on to it. It's like trying to hold on to the present. The present's always dissolving away from us, isn't it? In a sense, the present doesn't exist in time. I guess I believe that the beginning of the universe is there in every moment of the present, and that means that the world of possibility is still as big as the moments of the beginning of time, and that would suggest to me that I don't know anything at all, so I don't really need to worry too much about what's true, but I especially need to be concerned with what's beautiful and what's with love and the things that make us human. So I don't think I need to be too concerned with truth. Truth is not. It's something that it dissolves in every moment into something else that emerges in every moment and unfolds in every moment. So I don't particularly worry too much about it. That would be my contribution on top of what Paul said.
Perfect. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciate your time.
Ember, Ace, Mr. Driver, Michael, thank you. I really appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for letting me pontificate endlessly.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a wonderful day. We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we have. The truth is, any conversation worthy of having will inherently be a risky one.
Thank you for listening. Stay anti-fragile and carry on the ancient tradition and your own unique way of saying what only you can say and doing what only you can do. Abiding by Milton's words, this is Ember Sadat and Ace Deliri signing off, wishing you the very best of worthy and risky conversations.